has been suggested over these last days that we have within us a mandala, a crucible, or perhaps it can be stated that we are that mandala, that crucible, that contains not only all the aspects of our personal psyche, but all the sacred characters, symbols and archetypes of all the ages. And when we have access to this mandala, this crucible, we have the ability to comprehend every story, our story, and the stories of all others. Perhaps you'll have recognized that over these last days, the stories have had a theme, and this old story to be told is also with that theme. Let's see what happens when, having tapped this mandala, this crucible, what arises for us as an understanding of its deep meaning is the story about that king who, in fact, had been under the tutelage of a great Sufi heir for many years. So he ran his kingdom according to the ways of the Sufi. But one night, the king went to sleep and had a dream that his only son, a handsome warrior type, had died. And when the king woke up in the morning, fear took over his heart because there was no heir, since the prince had not married, to keep the lineage of his kingdom going. So, in his fear, he quickly made arrangements to find a suitable bride for his son, so that, in fact, he could hasten the process of having that heir to continue his lineage. And so it was that they found a princess in a far distant kingdom who fulfilled all that the king thought would be necessary for a suitable bride for his son. And the wedding arrangements were made. But it so happened that living along the route to the king's palace, there lived in a small cottage an old crone, an old woman who had lived her life. She'd had many lovers, but now she was ancient, toothless, her breasts drooping, as was the way with age. But she'd never known a loving relationship. She'd never known what it was to have companionship and true love, so she longed for it with all her heart. And it so happened that she had oftentimes seen the prince riding his great steed, and she'd fallen in love with him. So she used every means that she could to seduce him. She swathed herself in silk. She put kohl under her eyes and adorned herself in every way that she could. But to no avail. The prince would ride by. Of course, as was the way, he would acknowledge those who greeted him, but he gave no special attention to the old hag. But she became desperate, and so she decided to go to the devil to seek his aid. And when she confronted the devil, she begged him for a way to make the prince love her. But of course, even the devil said, "But look at you, you're over 90 years old and you're almost to the grave. Why bother?" But she hassled him and continually berated him until finally, to keep her quiet and get rid of her, the devil gave her a sachet of powder and instructions on how to use it. So it was that on the very day that the prince was to go and greet his bride-to-be, and with his mind thinking of her and how she would be and so forth, he was somewhat distracted as he rode past. And as it happened, of course, the old crone came out and tossed the powder at him, and suddenly he stopped in his tracks, because all of a sudden, instead of seeing an old hag, he saw the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and he was besotted. Immediately, he descended from his horse and became her lover, devoted to her, totally and absolutely at her feet, embracing her as a lover, seeing her as the most beautiful creature in all the world. Well, of course, it soon came to the ears and the eyes of the king as to what had happened to his son, and no beseechings, no beggings could turn the prince away from the seduction that had engulfed and embraced him. The king tried everything in his means, calling the soothsayers, the magicians, the physicians, but to no avail. It seemed that the prince was lost, completely lost in the dream. But then, in desperation, the king, having tried every means there was to break this spell, suddenly had a moment of realization and awareness, and recognized what it was that he had been doing. And in that instant, he completely surrendered all of the desire for it to be as he had willed and wished it to be. And as is the way with this, suddenly the king felt rising within him a great force, a great power. And in that instant, the spell on his son was broken. In that instant, in the moment of the prince's awakening, he suddenly saw the old crone for what she was. But he had welling up in him a great compassion, so he embraced her and finally she felt loved, loved in a way that she had never felt before. The prince took his leave of her and returned to the palace and presented himself to his father, the king. The prince took out his sword and said to his father, falling on his knees, "O father, father, I have erred. Lop off my head, for I can no longer continue." But at that moment, the king raised his son to his feet and said, "It is not you, my son, but I who have erred. Forgive me." They embraced, the king and his son, and we know the rest of the story.
They lived happily ever after.
Yes. The prince rose in splendor to claim his bride. The heir was produced, and the kingdom continued. What's the deep meaning of this story? Recognizing that all its characters are aspects of ourself contained in this mandala, this crucible, all playing their part. But what, knowing that these stories of late have a theme, what is it that you recognize arising for us as the meaning? What is it we comprehend and understand from what it speaks to us?